The golden hush of late afternoon wrapped the Al Rashan Palace in a quiet veil. Light spilled over the polished marble of the inner courtyard, reflecting on the rippling surface of the great fountain that sat at its heart. Birds danced above its waters, their shadows flickering like ancient calligraphy on the walls of ivory stone. The air smelled faintly of oud and sun-warmed jasmine, a blend that seemed to hang suspended in the golden light. Samira El Amin stood at the edge of the courtyard, a silver tray balanced in her hands, her abaya clinging slightly to her damp skin in the still desert heat. She'd been rushing. Layina, the sheikh's daughter, had darted toward the edge of the fountain, chasing a toy falcon that slipped from her fingers. Samira's heart had stopped for a moment. The moment that would change everything had arrived, not with thunder, but with the gentle splash of small feet slipping into danger. Layina's scream was more of a gasp, a tiny flutter before the silence of the water swallowed her. The girl didn't fight the water long, only the first few seconds, then only the sound of splashing, and then nothing. Samira dropped the tray. It clattered across the stones like a broken prayer. She didn't think, didn't even remove her shoes. Her body launched forward, slicing through the water like instinct, not choice. The chill struck her bones, unexpected, biting. Her arms wrapped around the child beneath the surface, and for a terrifying breath, Samira felt herself sinking with her. The hem of her dress dragged her down like hands from the past. But she kicked hard, dragging them both upward into air, light, and the sound of Layina's sobbing. As she coughed and clung to the girl, her eyes met those of Sheikh Zayed Al Rashan. He had just arrived. His voice boomed like thunder across the polished arches. The tray still spun on its side, forgotten, as he strode across the courtyard in his bisht, the gold trim fluttering in the dry wind stirred by his arrival. His eyes were wild, not with fear, but with fury. Layina was trembling in Samira's arms, her little fingers clinging to the soaked folds of the maid's abaya. Her braid had come loose, strands of black hair sticking to her forehead, her tiny feet, bare and cold, pressed against Samira's ribs. Zayed reached for his daughter, prying her gently away. He asked, his voice softening only for the child. "I slipped," the girl whispered, shivering. "Miss Samira." He didn't seem to hear it, or perhaps he refused to. His gaze locked on Samira, who stood drenched, her breath ragged, eyes wide, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what had just occurred. He snapped. She was playing with her falcon doll. There was no time, Your Highness. You can't swim," he said flatly. "I'm not a strong swimmer," she corrected, her voice barely a whisper. "But I didn't think." His words struck like a blade. "You endangered yourself and my daughter." "Yes," Samira said. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Layina's quiet sobs echoing against marble. The water behind them shimmered placidly, innocent, as though it had never threatened to take a life. "Get changed." He didn't look at her again. As she turned to go, her limbs heavy and dripping, Samira felt the weight not of water, but of silence, the same silence that follows when one dares to act beyond their place. She passed the rows of arched windows, each one reflecting her soaked figure like echoes of a mistake. She passed Rosa, the palace cook, who stood frozen by the colonnade, her eyes wide with something that looked like sympathy, but melted quickly into discretion. Samira said nothing. She walked barefoot, the wet fabric of her clothes slapping against her ankles, her dignity held together by the thinnest of threads. That night, the palace fell into a ceremonial quiet. The scent of oud burned in the hallways. The prayers at sunset echoed softly through the stone corridors, rising and falling like forgotten songs. She hadn't eaten, couldn't. Her chest still ached with the force of coughing water from her lungs. Her hands trembled from more than cold. No one had thanked her. No one had asked if she was all right. She had disappeared from the scene like vapor off hot stone. Outside, the fountains still flowed, as if nothing had happened, as if she had not breathed underwater for someone else's child, as if saving a life could still make you invisible. And in another wing of the palace, behind latticed windows and thick velvet drapes, Sheikh Zayed stood by the carved window of his private study. The room was dimly lit by a single hanging lantern, its colored glass casting rubies and emeralds across the tiled floor. He held a glass of water untouched in his hand, watching the rippling shadows of the fountain below. He remembered her hands on Layina's back, steadying, lifting. her lips pale, the fear in her eyes, not for herself. Still, his chest tightened with something else. Not gratitude, not even guilt, annoyance. He had built his life on control, and in a single moment, a servant had exposed just how fragile that control could be. He turned away from the window, the sound of the fountain still echoing in his ears, louder than the silence inside him. Dawn crept over the domes of the palace like spilled silk, painting everything in hues of soft apricot and pearl. The first adhan rose from a nearby minaret, a thread of sound weaving through the still corridors. In the servants' wing, Samira was already awake, kneeling on the prayer rug that faced the east. Her forehead touched the fabric, the whisper of supplication hidden in her breath. She did not ask for reward, only for clarity. When she rose, the scent of cardamom was just beginning to float from the kitchen. The cook, Rosa, worked quietly, slicing figs and warming cub's bread over the coals. No words passed between them, only the rustle of linen and the clink of ceramic bowls. The palace felt heavier this morning, not louder, not tenser, but expectant, as if it, too, was waiting for someone to name what had shifted. Samira moved carefully through the halls, her plain beige abaya clean and modest. Her wet garments from the night before had dried stiff near the laundry alcove. She touched them briefly, then turned away. No one had asked if she was well, and she had learned long ago not to volunteer her pain. She prepared the breakfast tray for Laina in silence. Toasted kubs, soft cheese, a handful of dried apricots, and tea with milk. How the girl liked it. She carried the tray with the precision of someone who knew that even kindness could be scrutinized in the wrong hands. Zayed was already in the courtyard, standing by the fountain, his back straight, the wind catching the hem of his bisht. His hands were clasped behind him, and he did not move when he heard her approach. "You don't need to serve her meals," he said without turning. "I know her routine," Samira replied softly. His silence was taut. Then he turned. His face bore the wear of a night without rest. His eyes flicked briefly to hers, then away. "I watched the surveillance footage," he said. A long pause stretched between them, a quiet that felt deeper than before. "You should have shouted. I was the only one who saw her fall," Samira said, her voice steady now. Zayed exhaled through his nose. "But I didn't." That truth, delivered with no defiance, settled over the space like dust over polished marble. Before either could speak again, soft footsteps approached. Laina, rubbing sleep from her eyes, dragging her small stuffed falcon by one wing. "Morning, Baba." Samira crouched to meet her. The girl smiled and clutched Samira's hand. Zayed hesitated. Samira stood straight again. "I've already completed my duties for the morning," she offered, not as insistence but as permission. Laina didn't wait for his answer. She led Samira to the table in the sunlit alcove. They sat across from each other, and Laina began to eat, talking in small bursts about a dream she had. A palace made of clouds, a horse with wings, a date tree that grew stars instead of fruit. Zayed stood a while longer, watching them with something unspoken coiling in his chest. "You still look tired," Laina said to Samira between bites. "You were like a superhero," the girl said brightly. Samira smiled. "Not quite." Zayed left the alcove without another word. Later that morning, in the silence of his study, he watched the footage again. Her figure leapt into the water as if propelled by something ancient. Not obligation, not calculation. Something older, like instinct. The part of a person that chooses humanity before survival. He paused the screen, saw the moment she disappeared briefly under the water, only to emerge, pushing his daughter above the surface. He hadn't seen that before. He hadn't asked. He hadn't cared. He stood for a long time before the window, hands clasped behind his back, the desert wind lifting the gauze curtains like they too wanted to flee the room. Elsewhere in the palace, Samira sat on a wooden bench outside the laundry room, fingers curled around a small cloth bundle. Inside was a photograph, her mother by the Nile, younger, smiling. And it didn't. It felt like drowning in silence, like rising without recognition, like saving someone and being told to disappear. The palace moved on around her, but something had changed, and it would not go back to sleep. The day unfurled like a silk tapestry, each hour a quiet thread woven into the golden hush of palace life. The sun rose higher, casting sharp angles of light through the mashrabia screens. Yet beneath the serenity, something had shifted in the corridors. Whispers moved like fine desert sand, soft, constant, invasive. Samira could feel them, not spoken directly, but laced in glances, folded into half-silences. The staff, though outwardly cordial, now paused when she entered a room. Conversations shifted, and smiles were thinner, as though saving a royal child had, paradoxically, made her more dangerous. She'd overstepped. That's what they thought, not aloud, but in the way their eyes avoided hers. Still, she moved with grace, holding her posture, her gaze lowered when appropriate, never retaliating. That had always been her strength, enduring what others whispered until it faded into the architecture. But this time, it did not fade. By midday, the heat pressed against the palace like a heavy breath. Samira had retreated to the textile chamber, where she often volunteered to mend the palace linens. There, surrounded by bolts of silk and fragrant cedar chests, her fingers worked quickly, as if sewing could still her mind. A voice pierced the quiet. It was Laina. The child had entered barefoot, her hair slightly damp from her bath, her fingers still wrinkled. Samira smiled softly. Laina settled beside her, watching. "My mother used to sit like this," she said. "Only she never mended." Samira looked up. It was rare for the girl to mention her mother. "She didn't like needles," Laina added, "but she loved watching the patterns." Samira nodded. "They do. Stories of patience, of quiet work." A pause. "In a way, the desert is beautiful," Samira said softly. Laina thought about that. "He's not wrong," Samira said. They sat together a while longer, the silence now warm, not punishing, until the door opened. Zayed stood there. His eyes moved quickly between them, his daughter on the floor, her hands tangled in colored threads, and Samira, poised with a needle mid-air. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "You're not," Samira replied, standing. Laina leapt up. "I didn't," he said, his voice gentler than before. Samira lowered her eyes. That comment lingered, a flicker of something in his gaze, regret maybe, or understanding. Later that afternoon, a message arrived. Samira was to present herself in the upper salon at sunset. It was not common. The upper salon was reserved for dignitaries, advisors, guests of lineage. Servants were summoned there only for punishment or reward. She climbed the staircase slowly, each step echoing louder than the last. The doors opened to a room bathed in warm amber light, its walls tiled in blue and gold mosaics. Zayed sat alone on a low velvet settee, a scroll in his hand. He gestured for her to sit, not at his feet, but across from him. "I've spoken with the palace physician," he began. "He said Laina is unharmed, healthy." Samira waited. "You saved her life," he said. A breath caught in her throat. "You did so without thought to your own." He leaned forward slightly. "Most would have used such a moment for advancement, for attention." Samira met his gaze. "I didn't vanish." He studied her for a long time. "I think perhaps," he said, "you belong somewhere neither above nor below." She said nothing. Her heart pounded too loudly. He stood. "I've instructed that your duties be reduced this week. You'll rest." Samira blinked. "They were my wife's favorite." She nodded slowly. He left without further word. The doors closed behind him with a soft thud, but their echo stayed in her bones. She sat alone in the golden salon, light flickering across the mosaics, and for the first time since the fountain, she let herself breathe. Not because she had been forgiven, but because she had been seen. The east gardens were unlike any part of the palace Samira had ever seen. Hidden behind latticed archways and a heavy bronze door etched with verses, the space felt untouched by time. Moonflowers crept up carved stone walls, and narrow marble paths curved between date palms and lavender. Fountains trickled with deliberate grace, each one set in mosaic basins that shimmered like jewel boxes. The air smelled of orange blossom and aged earth. It was not a garden meant for grandeur. It was a sanctuary of silences. When Samira entered it for the first time, she felt as though she had stepped into someone's memory. It was too personal, too sacred. She moved with reverence, her fingertips brushing the fronds of a fig tree. In the center stood a carved wooden bench, worn but beautiful, shaded by an ancient pomegranate tree. She sat there, not to rest, but to listen. Wind, water, leaves. And in the hush, she heard something she hadn't felt in days. Peace. That became her ritual. Each morning, after finishing her reduced tasks, she returned to the East Gardens with a book or embroidery hoop. No one disturbed her. Time unfurled slowly, stretching like warm honey across the stones, and sometimes she would feel eyes on her. From the upper balcony that overlooked the garden, hidden behind carved mashrabia panels, Zayed would stand, silent, unmoving. He never came down, not at first, until one evening. The sky bled crimson as the sun dipped behind the dunes. The muezzin's voice faded into a tranquil echo. Samira was seated beneath the pomegranate tree, her fingers working a constellation pattern into a linen square. The click of footsteps startled her. Zayed emerged through the bronze door. He wore no bisht, only a white thobe and soft sandals. Without his royal attire, he looked less like a sheikh and more like a man searching for stillness. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "You granted me the space," Samira replied gently. "But you made it something else," he said, eyes scanning the bench, the vines, the way her embroidery sat on her lap like a fragile galaxy. He sat across from her, not too close. "Laina sleeps easier now," he said. Samira nodded. "Faster than I expected. She's strong." He glanced at her. The air tightened. "She remembers her mother vividly," Samira added. "I wish she didn't," Zayed confessed. "No," Samira said softly. Zayed didn't answer. His gaze fell to her hands, still moving the needle through the cloth. "A map of stars," she said. She replied. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "I had not intended to come down here, but watching you, you reminded me of her, not her appearance." The compliment was not romantic. It was raw, vulnerable. "I don't mean to disturb old ghosts," Samira said. "You didn't," he said. A quiet settled between them. The fountains whispered. The scent of jasmine intensified. Samira felt the gravity of the moment press softly on her chest. She watched the man before her, not the figure of command, but someone stripped of title, anchored by memory and loss. There was no fear between them, only understanding. An invisible thread was forming, thin, tentative, yet undeniably present. She met his gaze, and for a fleeting instant, the space between them felt not like a divide, but a bridge, built on silence, on respect, on something unnamed but deeply human. When he stood, the quiet stretched. He didn't offer a promise, nor did she expect one, but his words landed like a stone cast into still water. Then he left, his footsteps fading into the hush of twilight. Samira sat in the garden long after, her embroidery forgotten on her lap, the last light of the day casting shadows in the shape of possibility. She leaned her head back, eyes open to the sky, where the first stars shimmered behind the drifting clouds. The linen still in her hands now bore more than thread and cloth. It carried the beginning of something unnamed. She rose eventually and walked the length of the garden path with slow steps, trailing her fingers along the carved stone. As she neared the gate, she caught sight of something tucked in the corner of the bench, a small folded cloth. Curious, she picked it up. Inside was a silk ribbon embroidered with the same constellation she had been stitching. It wasn't hers. She ran her fingers over the fine work. It was his hand. The prince had stitched the same pattern in silence, without declaring it, and left it like a secret shared between two souls, fluent and quiet. For the first time, a smile rose to her lips, one born not of joy, but of recognition. The next morning, she returned to the garden and placed a small offering in response. A single white blossom pressed into the folds of the ribbon, tied with golden thread. No note, no claim, only a gesture. And the next evening, when she came again, the ribbon was gone. But a pomegranate blossom had been left in its place. From that moment on, the garden changed. It became more than a refuge. It became their language. They rarely spoke in words, but in stitched stars, in exchanged blossoms, in silent tea. They began to write a story no one else could read. And though the palace walls were heavy with lineage and law, inside the hidden garden, two people walked the edge of something ancient, something tender, and infinitely forbidden. The scent of oud and crushed rose lingered in the hallways as preparations for the royal council intensified. The palace, always a well-oiled machine of protocol and precision, now hummed with the tension of approaching ceremony. Foreign dignitaries were expected. Advisors returned from distant provinces. The city's rhythms had shifted, leaning toward something ceremonial, weighty. But in the East Gardens, time continued to slow. Samira came earlier now, always with something delicate in her hands, an herb wrapped in muslin. a folded poem, a pressed flower. Zayed's visits, though still wordless at times, bore longer pauses, deeper looks, and the shared comfort of routine. They had established a quiet, invisible world that neither of them named aloud, yet neither dared pull away. Then came the first fracture. That afternoon, as Samira crossed the southern courtyard, two women stood near the marble railing, veiled in silks the color of desert fire. One she recognized as Lady Yasmin, cousin to the late princess. The other, a stranger, regal and tall, her gaze sharp as polished obsidian. They spoke softly, but not so softly that Samira could not hear. "She does not even carry noble blood," said the stranger. "She carries something worse," Yasmin replied. "Mystery." Samira passed them without pause, but her fingers curled around the folds of her abaya. The word influence echoed in her mind. It had never belonged to her world. Later that evening, a formal summons arrived, an invitation to the palace's private library. It bore Zayed's seal. She entered with careful steps, the soles of her shoes silent on the tiled floor. The air inside was cool and fragrant with old parchment and clove. He stood near the far wall, beside a window that looked toward the city. Scrolls lay open on a table, but he was not reading. He turned as she approached, and for the first time, he looked unsure. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You summoned me," she replied gently, unsure if she should bow. She didn't. He motioned to a chair. She sat. "There are murmurs." He looked at her, long and searching. Samira's voice was calm but steady. "Why now?" "A proposal was delivered to the council this morning," Zayed said. "An offer of alliance." She did not speak. Her hands remained folded in her lap. "It's expected," he continued. "A prince must align with tradition." Samira nodded, though her pulse thundered in her ears. His eyes searched hers for bitterness, but she offered none. "I never asked you for anything," she said. "You didn't disrupt it," he whispered. That silence that followed was thick, almost unbearable. Samira rose to her feet, but he stepped forward. "No, the garden remains." His hand hovered near hers, not touching, but close enough that the heat of his skin warmed her knuckles. "I may be forced to choose a future that pleases others," he said. And then, as if pulled by something neither of them could name, his hand touched hers, lightly, briefly, like a promise not yet made, but deeply felt. When she left the library, her steps were even, her face serene. But inside, a storm had begun. That night, she returned to the kitchens, her duties carried out in quiet rhythm. But her thoughts wandered. The memory of his voice clung to her, and the memory of his touch, a fleeting brush, yet enough to shatter the walls she had so carefully kept intact. In the days that followed, the garden remained empty. Guards lingered near its entrances, pretending not to notice her presence nearby. She waited twice, just to test if he would come, but he didn't, and that, more than anything, stung. Laina, too, seemed affected. She became quieter, her joy dimmed. "No, Habibti," Samira smiled, soft but sad. Sometimes grown-ups carry heavy thoughts. That evening, in a gesture that risked reprimand, Samira left a small satchel of dried jasmine blossoms on the garden gate. It was gone the next day. In its place, a single falcon feather rested on the bench outside her new quarters. She touched it with trembling fingers. In silence, they had found a new way to speak. A new kind of silence had taken hold in the palace. Not the peaceful quiet of the garden, but a calculated hush, one that hung in the air like the scent of iron before a storm. Servants avoided eye contact. Guards offered polite but wordless nods. Even the courtyards seemed to echo less. Samira's absence from the East Gardens did not go unnoticed, nor did the whispers that began to weave through the palace like smoke. They spoke of ambition, of transgression, of a servant who forgot her place. She heard them, of course, every word. She carried them in her silence, allowing them to ferment into resolve. Zayed, meanwhile, felt the palace watching him with the same intensity once reserved for his father. Advisors approached him with veiled questions. Council members hinted at urgency. Even his personal guard moved with heavier steps behind him. And then came the summons, from the one woman who never asked, only commanded, his mother. Sheikha Mahira awaited him in her private receiving room, a space perfumed with sandalwood and austerity. She stood beside the central brazier, the hem of her midnight blue abaya kissing the tiles as she turned to face her son. "You took too long to come," she said without preamble. Zayed met her gaze, knowing better than to argue. She did not gesture for him to sit. Instead, she extended a scroll sealed with a golden ribbon. An agreement with the House of Fulan, marriage terms, political stability, trade access, a noble daughter, unblemished. He took the scroll, but did not open it. She lives in expectation. The weight of her words settled between them. "I understand what you wish," Zayed said. "Then don't," she said, stepping closer. Zayed sighed. Mahira's lips thinned. "You were." At that, he looked at her directly. Mahira's brow arched. "No," he agreed. Silence. Then, a knife. "You are your father's son, Zayed." Zayed felt that old ache pulse beneath his ribs, the echo of a man he had loved and feared, respected and defied. He did not respond. There was nothing more to say. Mahira extended her hand to the scroll still in his grasp. Think well. He didn't hand it back, but he didn't open it either. That night, Samira found her quarters stripped of any trace of comfort. The small rug she had embroidered by hand was gone. The pomegranate blossom she had tucked near her bed had been removed. A new servant was assigned to her post with Laina. Her tasks now took her to the outer kitchens, away from the palace core, away from the child, and most of all, away from him. She said nothing. She obeyed. But each evening she returned to the old servant path behind the stables, where the eastern wall of the garden could still be seen. From there, she watched the lanterns flicker in the trees. She saw no figures, heard no footsteps, but the garden remained lit, its lamps tended. He hadn't abandoned it. He hadn't abandoned her. No name, but she knew his hand. She pressed the parchment to her chest. Days passed. Weeks. The council met twice. Rumors of alliances swelled. Guests arrived with daughters dressed in gold, each one a living proposal. Samira kept to her work, silent, watchful. Until one evening, as she carried a basket of herbs through the back corridor, a small hand caught hers. Laina. The child looked up at her with tearful eyes. "No," Samira said, dropping to her knees. "Never. I was sent away." Laina wrapped her arms around her neck. "I prayed. Every night." Samira held her tighter than she had ever held anyone. "They heard you." Footsteps interrupted the moment. A guard. Samira stood, expecting reprimand, but the guard bowed slightly and murmured, "His Highness requests your presence." The garden. She blinked. "Yes." Heart pounding. She followed. The path was familiar, yet everything about it felt new. Every turn was brighter. Every corner whispered. When she reached the gate, it stood open. Inside, lanterns burned low. The fountains danced. And in the center, beside the pomegranate tree, stood Zayed. He turned at the sound of her steps. "I had to see you," he said. She stopped a few paces away. He stepped forward. "The council has voted. They want a marriage of alliance." Samira's throat tightened. She looked into his eyes and saw everything. Regret, fury, longing. She asked softly. He didn't hesitate. A beat of silence. His voice broke. A single tear escaped down her cheek. He reached out and gently brushed it away. "I built this garden for my daughter," he said. She closed her eyes. "Then remember me here," she said, "where we weren't prince and servant." They did not kiss. They didn't need to. But when she turned to leave, he said one last thing. "I will find a way back to you." She did not look back. But her steps were heavy with the weight of a promise the world had no place for. Yet, the city beyond the palace walls breathed differently, louder, freer, and yet no less burdened by expectation. It was there, in the quieter edges of the inner quarters near the servant compounds, that Samira was relocated. Her world shrank to narrow alleys of tasks, woven mats, and silence. But her thoughts never left the garden, or him. Each morning, she awoke before dawn, not to escape duty, but to find solitude. Her hands busied themselves with tasks, washing, slicing, mending, but her mind retraced every step in the garden, every glance, every brush of his hand. She held his promise like a talisman tucked beneath her skin. But hope was a fragile thing in palaces built on tradition. Zayed, meanwhile, moved through rooms laced with gold and ambition. Every hour brought another discussion about treaties, titles, and the future. His counsel grew louder. His mother's presence became constant, and Rania al-Fulan arrived. She came with grace, with veils scented of neroli, with a voice that neither whispered nor demanded, and with eyes that studied everything. Zayed met her in the grand majlis, reserved for noble introductions. She bowed low, perfectly rehearsed, perfectly positioned. "I am honored by your welcome," she said. "You are most welcome," he replied. They spoke of geography, of family, of music. She played the oud, she confessed. He nodded politely, but his mind wandered to Jasmine, to stitched stars, to a girl who asked for nothing but left everything behind. When Rania was escorted to her guest chambers, she turned to Mahira and said, "He is courteous." Mahira smiled. "He is disciplined, and the foundation of loneliness," Rania murmured, but said no more. Elsewhere in the quiet spaces between memory and longing, Samira found comfort in her routine. She began teaching a group of young servant girls to read, her voice low, patient, rhythmic. Her dignity remained intact, never flaunted, never withdrawn. Then came the gift, a wooden box, unmarked, placed discreetly in her quarters. Inside, folded linen embroidered with constellations, her pattern, but stitched with the golden thread she had once used only in dreams. No signature, but no need. She wept then, silent, proud tears, not for pain, for recognition. She kept the cloth beneath her pillow. In the palace, Zayed's resistance became visible. He postponed the council's vote, declined formal announcements. He attended events, but remained unreachable. And every time he passed near the eastern corridors, his steps slowed, just slightly, just enough. Rania noticed. She was not cruel, not ignorant. She was, above all, observant, and she did something no one expected. She sought out Samira. Under pretense of inspecting the kitchens, she arrived unannounced. Her guards waited outside. Samira looked up from where she stood arranging dates on a tray. "Your Grace," she said, bowing. Rania's gaze was not cold. It was precise. "You are the one who cared for the child." Samira did not respond. Rania stepped closer. "I am not here to shame you, to understand," Rania said. Samira looked up, and in that shared moment, between two women shaped by different expectations, something passed between them. Not friendship, not animosity, something else. Rania smiled faintly. Then she turned and left, her veil trailing behind her like a question yet to be answered. The days that followed became harder to bear. Samira remained invisible to most, but not to Laina. The child continued to search for her in hallways, slipping past her minder to run down corridors, whispering Samira's name in the garden shadows. When Zayed caught her doing it, he didn't scold her. He knelt and held her small face in his hands. "I miss her too," he said. The girl asked, not as a child, but as someone born of palace truths. That night, Zayed walked the halls until the moon was high. He stood before his father's portrait, his hands behind his back. The painted eyes stared down at him, full of the same unyielding duty. No answer came, only the rustle of wind through lattice, but something settled in him, a quiet resolve. The next morning, Samira was summoned to the garden again. The message bore no seal, only a single pressed blossom. And that evening, when she entered through the eastern gate, the prince was already waiting. No guards, no advisors, just him. He stood beneath the arch of moonlight, wearing not the regalia of state, but a simple white thobe, his hair free of any ornament. She stopped before him. He looked around. "No," he said. She looked away, but he stepped closer. "I cannot change the laws today, nor the eyes that watch." He extended his hand. She hesitated, but then, with trembling fingers, she placed her palm in his, and the garden came alive. The garden had become a sanctuary once again, but it was no longer secret. Whispers moved like incense smoke through the corridors of the palace, curling into ears, slipping under heavy doors. The murmurs were quiet at first, a servant glimpsing the prince beneath moonlight, a scent of unfamiliar perfume left lingering in the air, laughter too soft to belong to protocol. Then came the drawings Laina made, two figures beneath a blooming tree, their faces undefined, but the golden thread stars above them unmistakable. It didn't take long before the court began to connect those stars with Samira's embroidery and Zayed's sudden silences. Within the grand chambers of judgment, Mahira stood like a figure carved from onyx. Her son had returned to her, summoned under the guise of gala preparations, though they both knew what truly brought them face to face. Her voice was calm, but there was a cold edge to it, one sharpened over years of watching kingdoms rise and fall. "You've broken tradition," she said, not as a mother, but as the mouth of legacy. Zayed remained standing, his hands folded behind him, his eyes unmoved. "If this is about Samira, it is about perception and duty and the cost of your choices," Mahira interrupted, her gaze narrowing. She walked across the room, each step echoing in the marbled quiet, and withdrew a sealed document from a chest, a decree already written, already anticipated. "The council has convened. Without you, they believe your judgment is—" He stepped forward. "No, but they can poison the ears of those who would hear it, delay your initiatives, undermine your authority." Her tone did not waver. Zayed's breath caught, not in fear, but fury. "I preserved what you were too distracted to guard. Do not reduce her to that," he snapped, his composure cracking for the first time. "Then elevate her, name her." But silence hung between them, a silence that neither affirmed nor denied, and Mahira knew, "You won't." Later that night, alone in his study, Zayed stared at the letter his hand could barely finish writing. It reached Samira's hands with no seal, only the softest fragrance of oud clinging to the parchment. She read it in the hush of night, under the glow of a single brass lantern, and though her heart ached, it beat louder than fear. The next morning brought urgency cloaked in sorrow. Laina had fallen ill, feverish and restless. Samira was summoned to the palace clinic, where the child lay under gauzy linen, her breath shallow and her small body too still. The physicians nodded gravely, whispering about the toll of emotion on delicate spirits. But Samira stayed at her side, day and night, humming lullabies, reciting stories with steady voice, refusing to let the child slip into a place where only solitude answered. Zayed came quietly, hours later. He stood in the threshold, watching them, Samira holding Laina's fragile hand, whispering comfort into her sleep. "She asked for you," Samira said softly when she noticed him, not rising, but offering him space. He approached the bed and brushed Laina's hair from her damp forehead. "She's afraid," he said. "She listens." Samira paused. His eyes locked on hers, heavy with the weight of things unspoken. A knock broke the stillness. A royal attendant bowed. Zayed's jaw tightened. "I will," Samira replied. The council chamber reeked of incense and polished power. Mahira presided like a queen unchallenged, her voice calm, her posture regal. "Your presence has been questioned," one elder said. "Rumors weaken the house," another murmured. Zayed stood before them, his voice steady but carrying the fire of blood. "We fear rebellion," Mahira said, unmoved. "She is not a whim," Zayed answered. "She is grace, dignity, resilience." Another elder spat. The chamber froze. Mahira's expression remained unreadable. "You have until the next full moon," she said. "Announce your bride." The doors opened. The sentence fell. The deadline began. The days that followed passed not in hours, but in a slow unraveling of certainties. Every corridor of the palace echoed with the sound of preparations. The full moon would soon rise, and with it, the fate of a kingdom. Invitations were sent in gold-inked calligraphy. Silk banners were unfurled from the balconies, and the grand fountain in the palace courtyard was restored to flow with rosewater. Rania al-Fulan's name appeared printed on the ceremonial scroll as Zayed's betrothed, her family crest gilded beside the royal emblem. Samira saw it only once, through the cracked door of the scribe's room, and though she said nothing, her hands trembled for hours after, the taste of salt lingering on her tongue from tears she had not allowed to fall. In the lower quarters, silence wrapped around her like a veil too heavy to lift. The women she worked beside offered careful glances, their words soft and often unfinished. No one asked questions. Everyone already knew. Samira moved through the days like a vessel of practiced stillness, but her soul churned beneath the surface, restless and tethered to memories she dared not voice. Even Laina, recovering but quieter, sensed the change. She clung to Samira at every opportunity, her eyes wide with the unspoken fear of losing the only soul who had offered her unconditional presence. "She doesn't sing anymore," Laina said one evening. her small hand clutching Samira's scarf like a talisman. Upstairs, far from the echoes of linen folding and spice grinding, Zayed found himself trapped in the rituals of expectation. His wardrobe for the wedding was chosen by advisors who measured honor in fabric and power in embroidery. Speeches were prepared without his input, and even his personal guard had been reassigned, replaced with men who bowed deeper to the Queen Regent than to the Prince. Mahira had tightened every thread around him. Every choice he didn't make was made for him, and every silence he allowed became a brick in the wall being built between him and his truth. Yet the garden remained. It waited in silence, unwatered, untouched. The lanterns no longer glowed at dusk. The scent of jasmine had faded, and yet he returned each night, standing beneath the pomegranate tree as if it still held the echo of her footsteps. On the third night, as the moon glistened above the marbled balustrades, he found something nestled in the roots, a folded cloth, her embroidery, but this time unfinished. Constellations broken in mid-stitch, stars fading into frayed threads. It felt like breath stopped mid-prayer. It was a message. She was giving up. Rania found him there, his figure caught between light and shadow. She didn't speak at first, didn't even approach. Her presence was like a wind shift, noticed only when the world stilled. She asked, her voice stripped of performance, bare and vulnerable. He turned slowly. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of all the choices he hadn't made. You know what they would do to her. She is unprotected. I also know what it means to be chosen and unloved, Rania said, stepping forward. I was not raised to become someone's sacrifice. From her robe, she withdrew the jeweled ring that had been sent to her with the engagement scroll. It sparkled briefly in the moonlight before she placed it on the marble bench beside him. Tell the court I ended it, that I was unfit. Let them shame me. I have the protection of my bloodline, but do not let them take you from her. She left without waiting for thanks, and Zayed, left alone, felt a clarity settle over him for the first time in weeks. That night, under the veil of silence, Zayed went to the eastern quarters. He passed the guards who looked away, not out of disobedience, but out of understanding. Past the corridors that whispered of scandal and fate. He knocked once, then entered. Samira stood near the low window, bathed in starlight, her hands clutching a scarf she no longer wore. She did not turn. They will exile me, she said. Still, she did not move. Because none of it matters, he said, voice low and deliberate. Not if I cannot walk through this life with truth. When she finally looked at him, he saw not fear, but exhaustion, not doubt, but sorrow pressed into bone. I was never meant to stay, she whispered. For the first time, something cracked in her restraint. Her breath hitched, her body trembled, but she shook her head. I would have everything, he said, stepping closer. Everything I never had in these golden rooms. Peace, choice. The silence between them was no longer a chasm. It pulsed, alive with risk, thick with longing, wrapped in the promise of ruin and the possibility of something freer than victory, liberation. She closed her eyes and nodded. Dawn did not burst through the palace windows with fire or glory. It seeped in like a secret, like the truth after too many years of silence. The skies over the domes were a soft, muted gold, the air clinging to the lattice screens with a stillness that suggested something sacred had broken loose in the night. But inside the palace, there was no peace. There was movement, measured, muted, almost ceremonial, as if the very stones beneath the courtyards anticipated disruption. The news had already bloomed like desert flowers after rain. Rania Al-Fulan was gone. She had returned to her family's estate by the sea, leaving behind only a sealed note for the council and the ring that had once symbolized the weight of an alliance. It was said she left with dignity, but even dignity, when removed from context, becomes rebellion. Mahira stood in the northern veranda, her robes wrapped tightly around her, as if the dawn chill posed more of a threat than the unraveling of decades of political control. She was not a woman accustomed to loss. Her entire reign as regent had been sculpted with discipline, strategy, and a kind of poised mercy that kept rivals respectful and allies obedient. But this was not a simple scandal. This was a fracture, a possibility that someone might refuse her and survive it. She summoned Zayed with a single word, come. He did, not with defiance nor apology, but with a calmness that frightened even her. His presence was no longer a prince performing his lineage. It was a man who had shed titles like worn armor. He bowed, shallowly, and met her eyes without flinching. The room was empty of courtiers. This was not a performance. This was reckoning. "I ended the engagement," he said. She asked it. "You humiliated her," Mahira replied, voice like velvet laced with steel. "I preserved the truth," he answered. "A union without truth is not a marriage." Mahira's fingers tightened around the ivory cane beside her. "You speak of masks, but you forget where you come from." "I have not forgotten," Zayed said. She inhaled slowly. "You've weakened every thread that binds our alliances. You've turned the whispers of the court into daggers. And for what?" He didn't flinch. "For love, for loyalty, for clarity." Mahira looked at him long, and for a moment, her expression cracked, just slightly. "You know what they say now, that the regent has lost control, that the prince is compromised." He didn't respond. She asked, quieter now. "No," he said. "I will leave. I will not make her a symbol to redeem myself in your halls. I will not tether her worth to your approval." Mahira went still. Zayed bowed again, lower this time, not out of submission, but in farewell. "Then let me be the man she chose." Far from the echoing silence of the regent's halls, Samira was already preparing, not frantically, nor with sorrow, but with method and stillness. She wrapped her few belongings with the care of someone packing not escape, but ritual. Her garments were folded like prayers, her shoes stitched by her own hand. Every piece of embroidery she had ever made was left behind, except one, the unfinished sky. That, she wrapped in silk and tucked into her satchel. It was no longer a farewell. It was memory, and promise, and defiance, sewn into thread. Laina waited in the corridor, clutching a small satchel, her hair brushed and braided. "I'm coming," she said, her voice firm. Samira paused. "I want to," Laina said. "He said we'd be together." Samira dropped to her knees and took the girl's face in her hands. "Then you come as you are. No jewels, no expectations." At the eastern gates of the palace, Zayed waited beneath the high stone archways, dressed not in the robes of royalty, but in plain desert linen, a woolen cloak fastened with a simple bronze pin. He wore no rings, no crest. His sword, once ornamental and gilded, was gone. He had become what he once feared, a man without a title, and yet he stood taller than he ever had in the throne room. When Samira appeared, her silhouette framed by the rising sun, Laina at her side, he felt breath return to his lungs. She walked toward him without hesitation. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw resolve, saw the quiet, steady storm of a woman who had survived every silence, every dismissal, every injustice. She was no longer a servant. She was no longer hidden. She was the truth. He asked, taking the girl's hand. "I am," Samira said, "not for the road." He helped Laina mount the horse, then offered his hand to Samira. She took it. They did not look back. They crossed the palace threshold just after the second call to prayer. No announcement marked their departure. No trumpet, no title. Only the steady sound of hooves on dust and the knowledge that something sacred had been reclaimed, even if it cost them everything else. Behind them, the palace remained as it always had, vast, golden, and merciless. But something within it had shifted, something irreparable, a seed of disobedience, planted not in anger, but in love. And love, once planted, does not stay buried. It blooms, even in silence, even in exile. The desert did not greet them with mercy, but neither did it cast them out. It received them with indifference, ancient, immutable, sacred. It was a world shaped not by power or lineage, but by endurance. The air was dry and thin, the light sharp as a blade, and the wind carried no songs, only the memory of footsteps and the quiet testimony of those who had passed before. Zayed, Samira, and Laina moved through it, not as fugitives, but as seekers. Each step away from the palace did not erase the past, but reshaped it. The farther they traveled, the lighter they became, not because they had shed sorrow, but because they had chosen to carry it together. Their path was slow, deliberate, winding through valleys of scorched stone and dunes that glimmered like gold dust. Zayed knew these lands from his childhood journeys with diplomats and falconers, though then he had traveled on silken cushions beneath parasols. Now, The sun beat on his shoulders without mercy, and the dust clung to his skin like memory, but he did not complain. He led with quiet determination, guiding them towards smaller settlements, places untouched by court whispers. Samira, wrapped in a simple thobe of linen, observed everything. The curvature of the dunes, the rhythm of the birds at dusk, the silence between one village and the next. In the palace, her world had been confined by stone and protocol. Here, the vastness gave her no answers, but it gave her space, and in that space, she began to remember herself not as a servant, not as a symbol, but as a woman shaped by her own will. Laina flourished. She ran barefoot through olive groves, braided Samira's hair under the stars, and began to sing again. Her voice, still small, carried a clarity that broke through the tension like light through latticework. Each night, her song wove a kind of spell, binding them together as dusk fell and fires crackled. They slept beneath wool blankets beside small fires, with stars as their ceiling and the occasional howl of a jackal in the distance. Food was sparse, bread soaked in olive oil, dried apricots, and dates purchased from kind villagers who never asked names. Zayed gave what coin he still had, but often it was Samira's gaze or Laina's smile that earned them a night of kindness. On the fifth night, they came upon a cliffside oasis where the water shimmered like melted glass. Zayed sat at the edge, watching the moon reflect on the surface. Samira joined him, folding her legs beneath her, silence passing between them like incense smoke. She asked finally, her voice barely audible above the rustling palms. "I regret not doing it sooner," he said. Samira looked into the water. "I almost did," he admitted. "But then I saw it clearly, and I saw you." She did not respond, but she reached for his hand, and this time did not let go. In the palace, Mahira's silence had become a storm. The council murmured of instability. Rumors slithered through the corridors like serpents, that Zayed had joined rebels, that Samira was a witch who had cursed the royal bloodline, that a new heir would be named in his place. Mahira heard every rumor and let them spread, for fear worked better than denial. But privately, she raged. She dispatched scouts dressed as merchants and scholars. They combed the villages near the borderlands, offering coin for whispers. It would not be long before she found them. But something else was happening, something she could not control. The people began to speak of Zayed not as traitor, but as legend, a prince who chose love over lineage, a servant who held the heart of the empire in her bare hands. Truth blurred with myth, but it did not matter. Myths, once born, are impossible to kill. In a white stone village near the edge of the Rub al-Khali, the trio was given shelter by a widow named Ajida. She offered them figs and fresh water, and did not ask questions until the third night. "I know who you are," she said, her fingers calloused from years at the loom. "The prince who left." Zayed met her gaze. Ajida shrugged. What is life without risk? That night, after Laina had fallen asleep, Samira walked into the courtyard, where lanterns glowed softly. Zayed waited near the fountain, arms crossed, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. She asked. "Eventually," he said, "but it no longer matters." She stepped closer. Her breath caught. "No," he said. Their hands touched. No vows, no crowns, only breath and the fragile power of presence. It was not the end, but it was a beginning. And just beyond the village gates, a stranger watched the windows flicker. He would return to the palace before dawn. The morning came veiled in amber haze, casting long, drowsy shadows through the quiet village alleys. A stillness hung in the air that was too deliberate to be natural, the kind of silence that precedes the shifting of something ancient. Samira stood before the small mirror in Ajida's courtyard, braiding her hair slowly. Not out of vanity or preparation, but as ritual, an act of grounding herself before the world demanded she become someone again. The unfinished embroidery was folded carefully inside her satchel, tucked beside a scarf that still held the scent of desert wind. Beside her, Laina tugged gently at her sleeve. Samira turned, brushing a thumb along the girl's cheek. Outside, Zayed stood beside their horse, adjusting the saddle. He wore a dark linen robe belted with leather, nothing ornate, but it fit him in a way the palace garments never had. His hands were calloused now, his jaw darker with the shadow of travel, and his posture no longer carried the weight of expectation, but of conviction. The messenger had come at sunrise, quiet, observant, and unmistakably royal. No entourage, no demand, just the message: return, speak, decide. Mahira had summoned him not in anger, but in strategy. The court was splintering. The elders were divided. Her silence could no longer hold the walls. She needed resolution. Zayed had become more than heir. He had become myth, and myth, when not controlled, begins to shape kingdoms from the outside in. Samira approached him. "No," he said. They mounted in silence, and the village watched them leave, not with curiosity, but with reverence. Children waved. Elders whispered blessings beneath their breath. One woman wept. The story had grown roots here, not because it was romantic, but because it was real. A prince who walked away, a servant who rose, a child caught in the middle who was loved nonetheless. It was the kind of truth that reshapes legends. At dusk, they stopped beneath an olive tree where the desert met the first stones of the capital. The palace minarets loomed in the distance, dusted gold by the setting sun. Zayed dismounted first. He stood there, silent, watching the horizon, as if counting the years he had left behind. Samira joined him. Her voice broke the stillness. "I don't care," he replied. She studied him. "Do you ever wonder if we were brave?" His eyes met hers, calm and steady. "I wonder what others will do when their moment comes." He turned to her then, brushing a wind-swept strand of hair behind her ear. "And you, whoever you are, wherever you are, if the time came to choose between duty and your soul," that question did not echo, but it lingered, a whisper in the blood of every person who has ever stood at the edge of certainty and known they could not stay. At the palace gates, Mahira stood alone beneath the arch of lions. She had not dressed in mourning nor in triumph, but in the layered black of political restraint. Her hair was veiled, her voice was still. As Zayed approached, Samira beside him, Laina between them, Mahira's gaze flickered, but not at Zayed, at the woman beside him, at the girl clutching his hand. She asked softly. "No," Zayed said. They passed through without ceremony. Inside the grand hall the council had gathered. Some faces hostile, some curious, many uncertain. Zayed stepped forward. He did not kneel. He offered no titles. He simply spoke. "I was born to serve this realm, but I was never asked if I wished to love it. I found my loyalty not in bloodlines, but in those who taught me what it means to be whole. This woman beside me, she did not seduce a throne." He gestured to Laina, who clung to Samira's robes. "This girl is not my heir, but she is mine in all the ways that matter. In every future I can name, she is safe." Mahira rose. "I never had it," Zayed said. "Not truly. I was placed in it," Mahira asked, her gaze locking on Samira. Samira stepped forward, her voice quiet but unshaking. "I am not here to be accepted." Silence held for a long, heavy moment. Then Mahira spoke again, not to Zayed, but to the court. "Let it be known, the prince returns not as heir, but as a witness." And thus, it was done. That night, the pomegranate tree in the garden bore new fruit. The jasmine returned. Zayed and Samira walked beneath its branches, not as rebels, not as royalty, but as two people who chose each other over every expectation ever placed upon them. In the quiet corners of the city, minstrels began to hum a new song. It carried through alleyways, echoed across tiled courtyards and into dreams, and in each version of the tale, one line remained unchanged. When given the chance to follow the rules, they chose love instead. And you? When your moment comes, will you step forward or look away?